Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is GenreVision. Every week, Travis and I review and recommend horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And this week, we're going to invest in the work of one Rick fucking Dalton. Yes, it's Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Real quick before we get to that, just a couple calls to action this week. We want to thank our new Patreon subscriber, Sam. Sam, I hope you're listening. Thank you so much for becoming a subscriber over on patreon.com/GenreVision. Because, Sam, you are now a subscriber, you get access to all of the awesome bonus content that we have for all the GenreVision shows, which include GenreVision, FinFlix, Third Time's the Charm, and bunch of other stuff we might have going on over there. We've been recently talking about some additional Patreon stuff we might want to do. But thank you so much, Sam. It's great to have you on board. Last little call to action is we put out a new FinFlix episode. And what was that episode on, Travis?
That episode was about a movie called Crawl. Kind of had a little inauspicious debut at the theaters. Didn't make a whole ton of money, but was pretty well reviewed, and for good reason. If you'd like to know more, you can visit GenreVision.com and listen to our episode of FinFlix all about Crawl right there, or go to your favorite podcast app and look up FinFlix. You're sure to find it there as well.
All right, we have a almost 3-hour movie to talk about, so let's take a trip back in time with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. We were talking about this, I think, in last week's episode, where I don't know what it was leading up to the movie, but you and I were feeling kind of, I don't want to say anxious, but not nearly as enthused as we probably should be for a new Quentin Tarantino movie. And after seeing Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I think part of that might have been, this is a very, very different kind of Tarantino movie. It still got his distinct stamp on it, but one of my initial reactions to this was that this is the first movie in his entire filmography where I started to feel his age as a director, and that's a good thing.
I would agree. Yeah, this is a refreshingly different movie from Tarantino. You know, I've read things that call this typical Tarantino, and I've read things that say that it's unrestrained, but that doesn't sound like people who understand what Tarantino's filmography has been like over the years. When you go from something like Hateful Eight, which was this very indulgent sort of cinematic stage drama, to this, it's kind of night and day in a lot of ways. Of course, it certainly feels like a Tarantino film, because it is. There's just a certain inescapable quality to Tarantino's style, but this is so much less stage bound in feel. You know, so many of his movies, even things like Inglourious Basterds, which is a World War II, action movie in some sense of the word, a World War II, sort of two-fisted action film in some senses like that, spends a long time in certain locations where characters are just sort of enjoying the patter of the conversation that's going on, and it's very stagey. And this movie is not. And as a matter of fact, the dialogue is quite a bit more low-key in this than almost any other Tarantino film, I think.
Well, one of the things about this movie that struck me is, if we think about Tarantino, especially kind of from Kill Bill to Hateful Eight, he's been very, very indulgent in terms of trying to replicate and homage certain filmmaking techniques and language from the cinema that he loves, whether that be Hong Kong and Japanese cinema, or mostly, for the majority of this back part of his filmography, Italian filmmaking, and specifically spaghetti westerns.
Right.
And, snap zooms and, all that kind of stuff, where it feels like, oh, nobody does this kind of stuff anymore because it was so of an era, and nobody, it feels like loving replication. But Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, there is pretty much none of that in the movie. It's interesting. I feel like when Tarantino's making movies like Django Unchained or Inglourious Basterds or Kill Bill or Hateful Eight, he's trying to make what he believes that movie could be in the time that it was made, not in a like total replication way, but he's trying to do it as best he can to honor those.
Right.
This movie, in terms of filmmaking language, while there's a couple moments of his bag of tricks, like a piece of comical on-screen text or something, it is so limited to the point where I have to call this probably his most grounded movie for the most part since Jackie Brown.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, pastiche, and you know, Tarantino is certainly a master of pastiche. Pastiche is very, very close to parody. And as soon as you cross a fine line from pastiche into parody, you amplify certain elements of a style to a point where people can't help but notice how silly they are or how different they are. And
well, just how much they stand out.
Precisely. In this, the filmmaking is much more open. He's not calling as much attention to those sort of attention-grabbing tricks, whether they be snap zooms or split diopter or, you know, super wide aspect ratio or 70 millimeter, all these sort of, you know, tools that he's used to sort of replicate certain things that he loves about filmmaking that are very strong ingredients. It's like putting a very funky, like fermented fish paste in your dish. It's like, yeah, it's there. You're going to notice it. And Tarantino puts those things in his films so that people take notice. And here is really not much of that. You know, coming back to the idea that you and I were sort of curious about this film, but a little wary almost of it, a little unsure of what to expect. I think it's difficult to describe what this movie is when you're trying to market it, because it's a character drama about two guys in Hollywood in 1969, set around the time that the Manson family was getting together and gearing up. Eventually, as we know, some of the kids from the Manson cult went to Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate's house, and they killed Sharon Tate and a few of her friends. It's set around that time as just sort of a landmark. And Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt are these two buddies that are trying to figure out their careers and their next stage in life.
DiCaprio plays Rick Dalton, who was a big television star for this kind of a riff on Wanted Dead or Alive called Bounty Law. And he left the show to try and get a movie career. It never really took off. And when we meet him, he's been kind of bumming around doing guest spots on television as the heavy and stuff, and, you know, doing a lot of pilots and hoping something will take off, but nothing's really working for him. And Brad Pitt plays his best friend and stuntman, Cliff Booth. It was so fascinating to me watching this movie because going in, I think you and I both had a hesitancy because we're like, okay, is this just going to be some worship piece about a bygone era of masculinity? Because it's very easy to see Tarantino getting wrapped like, oh, you know, back when men were men kind of thing.
Yeah.
That is not this movie. I mean, there's an element of that, but I don't think it's ever hero worshipy. It is surprising to me that Tarantino made a movie about male insecurity.
Yeah, it is definitely a masculine insecurity film. You know, we meet Rick Dalton at a point in his life where he's feeling extraordinarily insecure. When we first sort of understand the dynamic between Cliff and Rick, they're doing this promotional interview for their old show, Bounty Law. And they're sitting on some backlot somewhere on the, you know, the front porch of some fake saloon, and they're being interviewed by somebody from NBC. And Cliff explains sort of what he does for Rick, and it's, you know, to help sort of share the load, as they say it. And of course there is homoerotic subtext in that. It's designed to be there. There's a joke about it, but it really ends up being about the friendship and the role that these guys play in one another's lives, and that Cliff is there to support Rick because they're genuine friends.
Well, and I love that there's a bit of narration later in the movie that says the relationship between Rick and Cliff is, and I'm probably butchering this, but it's like when you love a man more than a brother and only a little less like a wife.
Mm-hmm.
And it's at a point where Rick and Cliff are possibly going to go their separate ways. And I found myself falling in love with these two men so much. It was very weird because looking at this in Tarantino's larger filmography, there's lots of his characters that I like, that I enjoy, that I find funny, or, you know, that I have some kind of attachment to. But looking back, there's few characters that I'd say I actually fall in love with. And Rick and Cliff, I fell in love with them.
Right. Well, I think it's a lot easier to invest in the human drama of this because it is so grounded. For people expecting something to be a lot more heightened, I think people might be really surprised and possibly disappointed by that. You know, the inciting incident of the story of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is not somebody getting involved in some sort of underworld scheme to smuggle drugs or somebody getting murdered. The inciting incident is Leonardo DiCaprio's character meeting with Al Pacino's character, who's his manager, his agent, a guy named Marvin Schwartz. And Marvin Schwartz saying him, look, you're really good. I've seen all these things you're in. Really like you. But your career in Hollywood is pretty much over and you should go to Rome and start starring in spaghetti westerns.
Which I love is, you know, and it's appropriate at the time, is like that is seen as a failure. You know, after that conversation, Rick talks to Cliff and he's like, you know, it's official. I'm a has-been, you know, he just told me the truth. Like, he wants me to go to Rome and make a bunch of spaghetti westerns. And there's a great exchange about like, those westerns are terrible. And Cliff being just the best friend, you know, he's like, well, come on now. How many of those movies have you seen? Maybe one. And like, he's so supportive and just such a good character. And while there have been cool and righteous characters in Tarantino's work before, Cliff might be one of his best, just lovable characters.
Well, Cliff isn't this guy who goes on these endless monologues waxing poetic about something or other. He's kind of a man of few words. He's certainly not stupid, but he's one of the more easygoing characters I think Tarantino has ever put up on screen. He's a guy that's kind of motivated by loving his friend and wanting to be there for his friend. And that sort of simple, genuine nature to this character is really refreshing to see. You know, he certainly has his not so savory aspects, like he's definitely motivated by getting laid, you know, so much so that he puts himself in potentially dangerous situations.
But not so much so that he'll take advantage of somebody who's underage.
That's correct. Yes.
That is, I think, a pointed moment in the movie.
Yeah, well, and it definitely still brings him into dangerous situations, and we'll get eventually to what that is. But the movie spends the majority of its running time on this, establishing this dynamic, establishing Rick's journey into no longer feeling like a hero, and embracing something where he says, I can't be the hero anymore. I have to find something else to do. And so he tries to find a way to be content taking these guest spots on other shows and playing the villain. And there is a lot of drama involved in that, but it's for a Tarantino film, very, very subdued. Tarantino wants you to spend hours in these guys' shoes in their daily lives, trying to figure out how do they go forward in life when they've hit a point where they feel stuck.
Well, what's one of the greatest elements of that structure and that exploration is the movie is so smart in how it divides its time between the characters. Because a lot of the movie does not have Rick and Cliff together. They kind of meet together for 3 or 4 times throughout the course of the movie to have substantial scenes together. But a lot of the movie just is like, okay, we're going to go spend 20 minutes with Rick now on the set of this Western pilot he's filming. And now we're going to spend 20 minutes seeing what's been going on with Cliff and what's his past like. It's so good at splitting all of that up and giving us individual time with the characters so that they don't feel completely codependent from a writing standpoint. Like they don't need each other in terms of being on screen together to be interesting. They are interesting on their own. And then it's their dynamic that also adds another layer of intrigue and heart to their performances. Another character that we have to talk about, and, you know, we'll stay spoiler free for now, is Sharon Tate, Margot Robbie.
Yeah. Cliff Booth drives Rick to and from his house. Rick lives next door on Cielo Drive to Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski.
And I know there has been some, I think, manufactured controversy about Margot Robbie not getting enough lines or something in this movie. And I think that misses the point of what Tarantino is trying to use Sharon Tate as in the movie. Sharon Tate is kind of everything hopeful and good about Hollywood.
And whether or not that's historically accurate isn't, again, it's not really the point, because the film isn't making a point of historical accuracy. It's trying to do something different. And what that is, we'll eventually get to, but it's using Sharon Tate to play a very specific role in this new history. And there's this really lovely sequence where Sharon Tate goes out on the town and she picks up a book that she had bought for her husband Roman Polanski. I think Tessa the D'Urbervilles she buys him.
Yeah, she buys it from Clu Gulager.
Yeah, that's right. A little cameo from old Clu, John Gulager's dad. So then she walks across the street and goes into a theater where they're playing a movie that she's in called, I think it's The Wrecking Crew with Dean Martin. Mm-hmm. And she plays this sort of klutzy hotel worker who's like supposed to be carting around Dean Martin's luggage. I've never seen the movie. I have no clue what it's about, and they only show a couple scenes from it. But it actually spends quite a bit of time with her getting used to the idea that she could be somebody really successful in Hollywood and not just Roman Polanski's wife. She goes into the movie theater and she sees people enjoying the film around her, and she starts to enjoy it herself. And it's not in a sort of gross narcissistic way. It's sort of a genuine way of, this worked out. You know, it's a very sweet thing.
I don't think this will happen to, I don't know, maybe, but that was the moment in the movie where I really started to well up, because this moment of her going into the theater, nobody in the theater knows she's there, and she's sitting alone and she's kind of loving the audience is being played perfectly by her in the movie. Like, they're laughing and they're cheering and she's soaking it in. It's so beautiful. It's beautiful for the idea of this woman and what she represents. It's beautiful for the experience of going to the theater and seeing a movie with an audience. It taps something very personal in me. This is all with like no dialogue from Sharon Tate. Like, I also thought it was, I think, purposeful that they didn't reshoot or try and reenact the scenes from The Wrecking Crew that they're showing and put Margot Robbie in the Sharon Tate role. It is Sharon Tate on screen.
Yeah. This movie does some stuff where, you know, they're recasting people in historical roles, but they want to make sure and choose when and how they're going to break reality. Mm-hmm. Like, you see Sharon Tate playing Sharon Tate on screen in this movie, The Wrecking Crew, and then it cuts to the reverse shot where Margot Robbie is in the audience, you know, reacting to this character on screen who is supposed to be her. And for me, that never felt like a problem. But then they'll do like really surreal stuff. Like, there is a sequence where Timothy Oliphant, who plays another actor who's, I think, one of the leads of this Western pilot that Leonardo DiCaprio plays the villain in, they're having a conversation about how his character Rick Dalton was almost cast in the Steve McQueen role in Great Escape. And so while they're having this conversation, the movie cuts away to like a fantasy where Rick is imagining himself in the role. And the effects used to do this, to actually put Leonardo DiCaprio as Rick Dalton in this role, are just nothing short of awesome. But the surreal clash, like the dissonance that it creates in your head, is like crazy.
It's like when you see those deep fake videos going around of like putting different actors into certain things where you're like, this is what's going on with my brain here, because I know what this is from historical context, But the way they do that with that Great Escape moment, and I just love, Timothy Olyphant, who's playing the actor James Stacey in the show Lancer, when he comes up and, he's like, I heard it was down to just you and McQueen. You almost got that role. And they play like the score from The Great Escape is this like dun dun moment. It's so funny. And that's something too. I mean, Tarantino has always, I think, been maybe not as appreciated as a humorist. I mean, his movies are always funny, but that's not what I think people drum up immediately when they think of Tarantino movies. I found Once Upon a Time in Hollywood to be consistently funny.
I thought it was pretty funny. It doesn't really feel so much like a comedy, at least not in the, say, first 3/4 of the movie, but it felt like a dramedy. It was a character drama, character study that also happened to be pretty darn funny. But there's also quite a bit of drama and metatextual drama that works in earnest as just plain old drama. Like even in sequences, there are extended sequences where they actually show scenes that Rick is shooting for this pilot, and they show them as if they're just playing out as part of the movie. And they don't do it with any effect. The aspect ratio doesn't change. It's almost like the movie changes into a different movie for a few scenes. And
for a long time, it feels like what's interesting is because with his last few movies, Tarantino has really been milking his Western love and different types of Westerns.
Right.
And this to me feels like, okay, this is his first time that he's really gotten to do American Westerns, and specifically American TV Westerns. Because for people who don't know, like, Westerns pretty much ruled television during the golden age of Hollywood. There were so many Westerns. But instead of, like you're saying, doing a pastiche attempt to replicate what that looked like, which is just going to be a bunch of, static setup shots, on a crappy stage kind of thing. He is, I think, replicating what it felt like to him to watch those TV Westerns and to feel like you're inside of it.
Right. Those sets are really impressive. That scene where Timothy Olyphant's character walks into the saloon and sees Leonardo DiCaprio's character, and they have this really extended dialogue scene where they order drinks at the bar and they go over to a table and they're served food. And then you start to watch a scene play out that we've seen Rick Dalton rehearse before. And when he rehearses it, it's hilarious because he's pre-recorded all the other characters' lines on a reel-to-reel tape machine. And he's done them in these horrible accents. He is hilariously, awfully drunk. And then we see the same dialogue play out, and it's done completely in earnest, as if it were a real film. And you actually break through that barrier, and it works as real drama. You invest in it.
It's astonishing. And I'm genuine, like you're saying. It's like, for a long stretch of the movie, it is just playing out as this Western that we know is a fake, that is a television show that's going on. But it goes on for so long and invests in itself so much and is so earnest that you buy into it, so that when Rick breaks character and forgets a line, they just keep going. I love that, the camera pulls back and they're like, okay, we're going to go back to one. And you don't see any of the behind the scenes. It's just the camera going back to a position.
Well, that camera move around Timothy Olyphant's shoulders is like a really great camera move. And you think at that moment, you're like, oh my gosh, this camera move is doing such a great job of, making, shifting the scene, turning it around, changing the geography. And then he fucks up the line and they have to reset back to one. And it breaks that reality and creates this surreal moment that reaches out through the audience and pokes you and goes, just in case you forgot, this isn't real. But then as soon as he sort of loses that momentum and is not able to get through the scene without asking for a line, Rick's performance changes and he starts to fuck up again and again and again. And his acting gets worse and worse and worse.
Well, and there's a great, and I don't know if this is written in the script or if this was a choice DiCaprio made, but Rick has a stutter in real life.
Yeah, there is a slight speech impediment.
Yeah, and it's great to see because when he acts, it's not there. And so when he starts to falter in his performance, it becomes more pronounced. It's never brought up. Like, nobody says it's like, oh, did you have to work on your speech? Like, it's never brought up. It's just this character thing. And that's the kind of stuff that I love in movies like this. For example, Cliff, as a stuntman, we get to see throughout the movie that he has all these different scars, never commented upon. And he was, you know, a war hero, apparently. He was in the military, but they never bring up his service or if some of these scars might have been from his service. We just see these scars and immediately that tells us a story about this character.
Well, what we know about these characters, or what we think we know about these characters, continues to grow and shift over the film because, well, the film plays some pretty clever tricks. I think we're kind of at a point where I'd like to enter the spoiler zone here, go beyond the spoiler wall.
Please.
Needless to say, like, before we go there, Drew and I both heartily recommend this movie, but it's probably not the movie you were expecting. We think that's a good thing.
I think in the best of ways, it's not what I was expecting. And I saw it yesterday. You saw it 2 days ago. And I think the more it's been sitting with us, the more we've been liking it.
It's growing on me. Yeah. I initially like that first scene where Rick Dalton is talking to Marvin Schwartz in the restaurant. I had a bad feeling. I suddenly got the unconscious urge to take my phone out of my pocket. And I was like, ooh, that's not good. Luckily, that feeling, I beat it away and it never came back. I was pretty engaged, from the scene where Rick is crying in the parking lot waiting for his car to be valeted and, come back to him. I was really engaged from that point forward. But yeah, give it a few minutes. The movie takes, I don't know, probably 15, 20 minutes to really get going. But when it does, I think you can really invest in the dynamic between Rick and Cliff.
Well, let's dive into spoilers. So, I mean, we said a couple specific moments in the movie already, but I think we have to get into even more specifics to talk about where we're going, because obviously having Sharon Tate in the movie creates an expectation and a built-in tension about the movie. Because anybody, I mean, unless you know nothing about who this person is, or even if they're a real person, if you have any inkling of who Sharon Tate is and was and what happened to her, just her being in the movie, you are put in a sense of unease.
Well, if you know anything about the Manson murders, and you look at all the different things going on in the film, like the inclusion of Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, the date, like there is an actual on-screen text, a little super that shows up that says, the date in the year, and you think, that's pretty adjacent to the Manson murders. And then as time goes on and they keep doing that, you think they're getting closer, they're getting closer, they're getting closer, like something's going to happen.
So having that built-in tension, I was like, okay, how's this going to play out? But getting back to Sharon Tate and what she's kind of being used to represent, I can't speak, for everybody. Of course, if people take offense to this, I would love to hear their perspective. But I really feel, and obviously they had to, and it's in the credits, they had special thanks to people in the Tate family, and I'm sure wanted to clear what they were doing with them. The way that this is handled and making her a figure of, like I say, everything hopeful and good, and kind of what should be the shining example of what the Hollywood actor experience can be and the celebrity experience can be. Margot Robbie doesn't need a bunch of lines to get that across because she's that good of an actress.
She is extraordinarily good. We've all seen her be really, really good. This is not a movie where she gets to be a dramatic lead. She's just not that. I know that she's one of the 3 top billed people and that her face is just as big as the other people's on the poster. But truth of the matter is she's not in the movie as much, and she doesn't have as much to do and doesn't have as much to say. Some people will be disappointed by that. I can imagine that disappointment. I originally expected that Margot Robbie would play a heavy role in the film. She just doesn't. And the movie has a different purpose for Sharon Tate as a character. In some ways, that's unfortunate. But in other ways, like given the way that the movie actually plays out, I think that they managed to kind of maintain a respectful distance from the reality of who Sharon Tate was.
That's what I'm saying. This is not attempting to be a historical representation, not just in fact, but in any kind of way about Sharon Tate and her life. This is, what did Sharon Tate mean in the history of Hollywood, in the history of America? You know, the Tate LaBianca murders are kind of seen as the moment where the hippie free love movement died, because it was everything dark and insidious about that writ large in the most horrific way possible.
Suddenly there was a hippie cult and they were murdering people. They were saying, you know, they were here to do the devil's work, and they wanted to kill cops and all this sort of stuff. It's like, oh, okay, we have turned a corner in American culture.
Yes.
And it was viewed as one of the things that marked the death of the 60s.
Right. I mean, it's appropriate that it happened in 69 just for numbers reasons, but it really was a seismic spiritual shift in the counterculture and everything. And what I like is that Rick and Cliff aren't wrapped up in that. They kind of hate hippies, which is great.
Well, they come from a prior generation, and, you know, there's certainly some political subtext in that kind of stuff. Cliff sees this hippie chick, you know, who appears, of course, 3 times in the film, hitchhiking. And, you know, the first 2 times, Cliff turns her down and says, no, I'm not going to pick you up. But, you know, there's definitely eye contact shared.
Well, he sees her once after they've been garbage picking, which is all I'm very familiar.
Dumpster diving.
Yeah, with the Manson stuff. That's what they did. They're singing probably Manson's most famous song.
Mm-hmm.
He sees them crossing a crosswalk. Then he sees her hitchhiking, and she's pointing, are you going that way? And he's like, nah, sorry, I'm going the other way. But, you know, good to see you again. And then the 3rd time, he is going her way, so he chats her up and decides to pick her up. And this is when the movie has its first real big tonal shift, because they go visit the Spahn movie ranch, which is where the Manson cult was, you know, living and kind of taking over and taking advantage of George Spahn in his old age. And this might be the most Tarantino has ever dipped his toes into outright horror.
Yeah, there were certainly some elements of these kinds of things in Pulp Fiction and Hateful Eight.
But this is way more extended.
Well, this is like Texas Chainsaw.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is like the first act of a different movie. Again, like there is this big tonal shift, and there's actually some stuff that almost borders on original score for this. Like there's some things that are, you know, people tend to argue, is that sound design, is that score? But there are these like low drones when you see the groups of, you know, the Manson family members standing outside the buildings at the Spahn Ranch. It's like, ugh, something really bad is about to happen.
Oh, and they're just, they turn into like Invasion of the Body Snatchers people.
Well, it's almost like, you know, the scene in Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, where you see the birds gathering on the swing set.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's that same sort of growing tension without using the primary instruments of the orchestra to telegraph it.
It's great. And considering she is basically only in this one sequence in the movie, how near unrecognizable and terrifying is Dakota Fanning as Squeaky Fromme?
Oh man, she is so creepy. That scene that she has with Cliff through that screen door is really scary, and she is genuinely frightening.
I didn't know it was her at first. It's just really good acting and costume and makeup and hair and everything. And even though I saw her name in the opening credits, like it took me a second. I'm like, oh shit, that's Dakota Fanning. And she's so scary. I've never been scared of Dakota Fanning until this movie. It's so good. And it's like one scene.
Well, the casting of the Manson family members is some of the best casting in the movie. Like, Lena Dunham, as annoying as she can be with her weird outbursts, is she's pretty brilliant casting as Gypsy.
She is perfectly cast as just everything that's awful about that stereotype of a hippie.
Yeah, the actress who plays Nell in The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix shows up. She is one of the Manson family members. Maya Hawke, oddly enough, Uma Thurman's daughter and Ethan Hawke's daughter, she's in the movie as one of the Manson family members. The guy who plays Tex, this young guy named Austin Butler, he's even scarier than Charlie Manson. He's fucking freaky.
Well, Manson is very peripheral in this movie. There's even shots that they've used in the marketing that are not in the finished film.
Sure. He's really only in, what, one scene?
Pretty much. I mean, Manson is as much a concept and an idea as Sharon Tate is in this. Kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum. But really, as far as the head terrifying male figure that we get, it is Tex, and Tex is so creepy. he looks like, I mean, I don't know if I've seen that actor before, but he looks like a really emaciated Taylor Kitsch.
Yeah, he does have that sort of similar energy to him.
But he is so scary, especially where the movie goes. So this whole Manson element, we feel like we know from all this setup, because the movie does plenty of setup of, okay, at some point, these two paths are going to converge, Rick and Cliff's along with the Tates. And the way that Polanski and Tate are set up for Rick is very early in the movie when he realizes, like, oh man, that's like Roman Polanski's living right next door to me. And he gives this speech about, I was taught that you can't rent when you're in Hollywood. You have to buy. You have to live here and be Hollywood. That's the only way you're going to succeed. And this is what I'm saying. Right next door is Roman Polanski. I'm, just a pool party away from being cast in the next Roman Polanski movie.
Yeah, he says fucking, Rosemary's Baby's Roman Polanski.
Yeah, well, yeah, he's just like the director of Rosemary's fucking Baby.
Yeah. Well, there's a scene where you see Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski and several of their friends go to the Playboy Mansion, and you see other stars from the time, like you said, some really great stunt casting of what's his name?
Damian Lewis.
Yeah, Damian Lewis plays Steve McQueen in a scene at the Playboy Mansion.
Perfect.
And basically all he does is explain the dynamic between Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski, and this other guy, Jay Sebring, who had previously been involved with Sharon Tate before she married Roman Polanski.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a whole bunch of stunt casting as historical Hollywood figures, but when it does, it works pretty well. And but this whole setup of Rick, clearly he's like, that's my chance. Like if I get into this pool party, if I get this moment, that's going to be the thing that could reinvigorate my career and really help me take off. And that's such an important setup for where the movie goes.
So after Cliff narrowly escapes his death potentially at Spahn Ranch at the hands of the Manson family.
Just the most badass way when he beats up that one hippie guy.
Fuck that guy.
It's so cool. I can't deny it's fucking cool.
Yeah, I mean, well, they definitely wanted you to, like, Cliff is definitely a thirst trap in the movie. Like, they want you to think Cliff is hot. Like, there is a scene, like, it's the first, I think, legitimate thirst trap in a Tarantino movie where Cliff, earlier in the film, climbs up on a roof and whips his shirt off because he's, like, repairing Rick's TV antenna. And it's the first time in a Quentin Tarantino movie where I went like, damn, Tarantino, you really want us to fall in love with this guy in more ways than one. But after the Spahn Ranch sequence, there is a jump in time. Rick Dalton finishes up his filming. It's like a day of filming on this Western pilot. And at the end of the day, after having this huge meltdown and, having to sort of have this come to Jesus moment, he and Cliff meet back up again.
God, there's so much to talk about. We can't, before even that. So he has this breakdown on the set of Lancer, and he has this moment in the trailer where he's, chiding himself and saying, you embarrass yourself. He's looking in the mirror and he says to himself, if you don't go out there and get that right, I'm going to blow your fucking brains out. And my audience was laughing, during this whole kind of breakdown moment for Cliff, because I think at that point it was like, okay, he's making fun of his own stuttering and he's doing all this kind of very exaggerated stuff.
Well, it's the first time we see a Leo go completely cranked to 11 in the film.
Well, and everybody around me was laughing because I think, yes, he's cranked to 11. There's an awkwardness to this that people are going to laugh at. But for me, I felt horrible. You know what it kind of reminded me of is the Nicolas Cage freak out in Mandy.
Yeah, it definitely gets close to that. And one of the stranger elements of the scene is that I think it's all shot from the same angle, but there's a mirror on one of the walls that when he sort of trashes his trailer, the mirror kind of turns toward the camera. And when he's delivering this monologue to the mirror saying, I'm going to blow your fucking brains out tonight, the camera is turned toward the mirror, and so his reflection is looking directly into the camera lens. And it sort of makes the vulnerability feel real different. I get why the scene could be seen as funny, but I did genuinely feel bad for him.
No, I felt I felt really empathetic in that moment. But so then he goes back, and there was a scene earlier where he's talking to pretty much the star child actress of this, and who's played by an actress called Julia Butters. And she's kind of method. She's like, on set, I like to be called my character's name, which I think is like...
Takes her job very fucking seriously.
Yeah, she's a very well-spoken, very articulate, very serious... she's like, as an actor, and I don't use the term actress because that's redundant or like, stupid or something.
Yeah.
She's very kind of almost method. And the scenes between Rick and this young actress are, it shows kind of the empathetic nature that a lot of the industry is based around in terms of actors. Like, these are people that kind of by their profession have to be able to tap into an empathy. And after Rick has this big freak out and he comes back and he has to do this scene with this actress where he's holding her hostage, and it just turns back into that Western. That sequence of like, I'm watching Rick overcome his anxiety and his insecurity. I'm also watching on another layer this scene within the movie. The layers of performances that they have to be doing and that the filmmaking has to capture, it's awe-inspiring.
Right, and it actually allows you to invest in the multiple levels of drama going on, because the scene, like the Western scene where he's holding the girl hostage, legitimately works. It allows you to forget in the moment that there's this other thing going on, and you're going, oh man, he's doing a really good job acting, and this is really good. And then of course there's this sense that this actor is rediscovering his talent and his energy.
Well, like even the moment in the scene where he throws the girl down on the floor, I was like, whoa, that's, wow. And then when they cut and they're talking about it, the director is like, that was a great idea you had to throw the girl on the floor, and they talk, she's like, yeah, I'm fine, I had pads. I'm like, wow, this is such a great, heartfelt way of showcasing the magic of movies and how that magic trick is done.
Yeah. Oh yeah. All that stuff is just tremendous. And then he's able to, go back home after a hard day's work and just enjoy spending time with Cliff, who has just narrowly escaped the hands of the Manson family. And on the way back home, Cliff has bought an acid-dipped cigarette.
I love it. It's like, you got an acid-dipped cigarette. Hard cut to, do you want to buy an acid-dipped cigarette? What is it? It's a joint dipped in acid.
How much? 50 cents. Okay. Yeah.
Well, and they're going to watch Rick's guest spot on an episode of FBI, which again, they do a great job of recreating that and placing him in that episode. Because there's obviously elements from a real episode that they used.
Yes.
You kind of described it because you saw it before me. It's like, this kind of gets close to being a Hangout movie. This is pure Hangout, and this scene is one of my favorites, where the camera just stays on the television. The entire not like just a zoom in of the screen. We see the entire box around it and everything. And we're just hearing Cliff and Rick's commentary. And it's so fun. It completely feels like I'm in the room chilling with those guys.
Oh yeah, no, it's really just like watching the two of them hang out and watch an episode of television together.
So fun.
And I can see people being turned off by this. People who are used to scenes where Kurt Russell is knocking, Jennifer Jason Leigh's teeth out and all this sort of stuff because she's a dirty criminal. And this isn't that movie. It is definitely a Tarantino film, but it is not on that level. and it is not doing the same things. It is, however, coming to an exceptionally violent climax, but that won't be for a little bit.
Well, before we get another scene that we talked about, there's so much. I can't wait to watch this movie again. When we start learning more about Cliff and his past, there's a big extended scene where they were on the set of some show, and Kurt Russell, now you mentioned him, shows up as Randy, who must be like Stuntman Mike's older brother that he mentions or something, whatever the connected Tarantino universe.
When Rick Dalton goes to work, he then, he goes into that makeup trailer and says, you're going to get made up like this. You're going to get your fringe jacket, your hippie mustache, and this hat, and you're going to look exactly like a hippie. We then cut back to Cliff Booth. Cliff is then preparing to fix the antenna on Rick's roof. Cliff walks up onto the roof. He's got his beer in his tool belt.
Great shot.
He whips his shirt off. He looks over at Sharon Tate's house. Sharon Tate is, I think, packing a bag or something like that.
Playing some music.
And we then cut to Rick talking to Kurt Russell. It then appears that we have jumped forward in time and Cliff has joined Rick on set of this pilot.
No. That's not what's going on.
Oh, what happened? Okay.
This was when Rick was on an episode of The Green Hornet. This is a flashback to the past.
Oh, I thought it was a fantasy.
No, it's a flashback to the past when they were on the set of The Green Hornet. And this is
okay.
This is explaining why it's been tough for Cliff to get stunt work outside, and why Rick has been fighting for him and all of this.
So I thought this was I thought this was just Cliff having a fantasy about why he shouldn't go do the show. Oh, it's a flashback. I see.
Well, because Rick talks, because Cliff is asking him like, hey, could I come be a stunt on this pilot for Lancer? And Rick is like, no, the guy that booked this for me was, the grip or something that worked when I was on that episode of Green Hornet. And because of what happened on Green Hornet, they know about you, and that's why they're not going to let you, do this show.
See, as soon as it got into the stuff where he was beating up Bruce Lee, who is another brilliant bit of stunt casting, a guy named Mike Moe plays Bruce Lee, and it's definitely sort of an impersonation type performance. But as soon as it gets into that section where he's beating up Bruce Lee, I don't know. I kind of might stand behind the idea that this is not purely flashback, that this is sort of Cliff remembering things how he wants to remember them.
Sure. I mean, it's from Cliff's perspective and his recollection.
Right.
But
which makes me think it's not strictly flashback, but maybe these are the things worth discussing. It's not explicitly stated in the movie whether it is flashback or fantasy.
Well, because within that flashback to whatever this event was, we hear about why people don't like Cliff, and it's supposedly that he might have killed his wife and gotten away with it.
Right, which we don't know we don't know if it's actually true or not.
We don't know anything, because this is not centered for, I think the way they frame it is like, okay, within this flashback, there's another flashback of Cliff on a boat with his wife, with, again, one scene stealer, Rebecca Gayheart, as his awful wife.
Who may not actually be real.
It may not be, but he's, getting geared up to dive, and he's got this bang stick.
Spear gun.
Yeah, she's standing up in front of him and just and he's just got the thing pointed at her, and then it cuts away, and we never know what happened.
Right.
It's so funny.
That's going to gnaw at me until I get the chance to watch this movie again or hear more about this movie, about whether or not that flashback is explicitly stating things that are true in the sort of, diegesis of the film or not.
Well, it's based in some reality because of that whole thing of Rick saying, you can't work on this pilot because of it was booked through a guy that worked on Green Hornet, and you burn that bridge because of what happened on Green Hornet. But because it is coming from Cliff's perspective, it's possible that this friendly contest he had with Bruce Lee was not as, one-sided or, kind of wonderful for Cliff. But I think it is, because we have to buy Cliff by the end of the movie as kind of a superhuman.
This is true. Yeah. But the movie kind of loses touch with anything that might be considered a discernible reality by the end of the film. Like, okay, so we're at the point where Cliff has escaped the Manson ranch, the Spahn ranch, with the Manson family, and Rick has come home, and they're watching FBI. The acid cigarette is now in a little cigarette box on Rick Dalton's coffee table. We jump forward 6 months, and in those 6 months, Rick Dalton has gone to Rome, starred in 3 or 4 spaghetti westerns, gotten married to an Italian woman.
Not just spaghetti westerns, also a James Bond ripoff called Operation Dynamite.
That's right, Operazione Dynamite, which is very, very funny.
And they show a great kind of mocked up scene, which again is using some footage from, I'm assuming, a real film from that era. And then there is a little bit of that Tarantino on-screen text humor where they show a giant ramp jump with a car, and then it stops and you just see Cliff with a little arrow on it. But yes, they've come back from Italy, and this is when we get a lot of narration from Kurt Russell, who I don't think has done narration stuff for Tarantino before.
It's perfect, though. Works.
It is. It's very perfect. And he's talking about while they were there, now that Rick is married and, you know, they're going to try and do this other stuff, that it's kind of time for them to go their separate ways. He says, like, I can't afford you anymore, you know, to pay you as my stuntman or, you know, have you as my driver and all this kind of stuff. I just can't do it anymore. And there is a mutual understanding. Like, it's clear that both of them are sad about this, but they understand. And as the narration says, like, when you love a man more than a brother, but only a little less like a wife, the only way to celebrate the ending of that pairing is to get blind drunk.
So they proceed to go out. They get shit-faced. They take a cab back to Rick Dalton's house because both of them are so drunk. Normally, Cliff doesn't, you know, Cliff is the designated driver because Rick Dalton's been arrested one too many times for drunk driving. By the way, I love that little insert of Rick in the back of the car early on in the film when they explain that. But when they get back to the house, Rick's Italian wife is asleep due to heavy jet lag, and they decide to keep drinking. Rick Dalton decides to put together a blender full of frozen margaritas. Cliff decides to take his pit bull on a walk.
Brandy.
Down Cielo Drive. Brandy the pit bull. And of course, he thinks, you know what? Tonight's the night for that acid cigarette. So he starts smoking that acid cigarette, takes his dog on a walk. Rick Dalton starts getting that blender full of margaritas together. And meanwhile, over next door at the Tate Polanski household, they have had a party there and they're sort of settling down for the night.
Yes, I mean, at this point, Sharon Tate is pregnant. They keep going back and forth between Rick and Cliff's night and Sharon's night, which is, you know, going out to a restaurant, and she's feeling kind of, you know, I think they call it, like, you know, that pregnancy melancholy. Mm-hmm. And because it was recorded as
hot,
the hottest night, you know, the hottest night of the on record or the year, that it's making her especially down. So, and it's all being very specific with timestamps and on-screen timestamps and everything. We know it's like, this is the night of the murders. And so midnight rolls around and the Manson family comes riding up in this beat up, nasty old Chevy. And we're like, okay, this is it. But because this is another piece of revisionist history from Tarantino, when they drive up, because their plan is to go in and because they're like, you know, Charlie told us to go into the people who are living in that house and kill everybody there. But because their horrible, disgusting car is making so much noise, Rick Dalton comes out in his robe holding his margarita blender, and just starts going off on these hippies. It is so funny.
He loses it so badly during that scene. And when he finally manages to scare all of them off, he takes this big swig right out of the fucking blender jar. It's the perfect punctuation on the end of that scene.
Well, he's
so good.
He's chastising Tex, who's in the driver's seat, and he's just like, you need to get this damn thing, you know, back it up. He's like, all right, let me turn it around. And he's like, put it in reverse, and he's just staring down Tex while he's sipping from this blender. It's so good. But then one of the members of the Manson family that's there says, hey, I've been racking this idea in my brain, like, all of us grew up watching television. If you grew up watching television, then you were watching murder because there's so much murder on TV. So instead of going into the Tate house, because they recognize Rick Dalton. They're like, that's Jake Cahill from Bounty Law. And Texas is like, I had a Bounty Law lunchbox. It was my favorite lunchbox. And this girl is like, let's go kill them because they were making all of this art that fed us this murder, and that's why we're so fucked up.
Right. This girl Sadie,
yes,
in the one of the Manson family members is the one that convinces him. It's like, you know what? Fuck it. We're gonna go kill Rick Dalton because he's been selling us murder on television since we were children.
This feels like a moment of commentary that Tarantino has been building up to with his whole career about the influence of art on the audience, especially in regards to violence.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, then they decide to go into Rick's house, and Cliff is in there. The acid is kicking in as he's starting to set up his food for his dog, Brandy, which was set up in a great scene earlier when we meet him at his trailer that he lives in outside of the Van Nuys drive-in.
I love how Tarantino knows to establish routines for characters in films so that they can set the rhythm up of a scene and know that if this information plays out later, it'll give us sort of a rhythm and an expectation and a suspense built into the scene. As he sort of puts together this meal for his dog and the Manson family kids are coming up into the house, it's like, oh, is he going to get there? What's going to happen? It's such brilliant staging and pacing and editing. And then when the kids finally come into the house, all hell breaks loose, but not before some fucking hilarious dialogue.
Well, because Cliff is stoned out of his mind.
Tripping balls.
Yeah. I was glad because you were like, oh, the movie is kind of surreal. And when it got to this, when it set up the acid cigarette, I'm like, oh, is Tarantino going to go full on kind of hippie psychic psychedelia? And no, we never see that. Yeah. It is only in Cliff's performance. And he is so nonchalant and kind of amused by these people that are there. And even one point he says like, are you real? And Tex is like, I'm as real as a donut, motherfucker.
Yeah, well, he goes, I'm the devil and I'm here to do the devil's business.
Well, because Cliff recognizes him. He's like, oh, wait, I remember you from Spahn's ranch. What was your name? And that's when he says, I'm the devil and I'm here to do the devil's business. And then Cliff's like, no,
that's not it.
He's like, it was something dumber than that.
Yeah.
And then
at this point, he has like, Tex has his huge fucking revolver in Cliff's face, and I love it. Cliff puts up the finger guns and is like laughing right at his face. It really is brilliant, and the movie makes this huge shift, and you start to realize that the past like 2.5 hours of the movie were set up for this huge punchline of these Manson family kids coming into the wrong motherfucker's house and meeting their horribly violent, cartoonish demise.
Oh my God.
At the hands of one of the best stuntmen in Hollywood and his actor friend who,
and his
at
dog.
that point, and Brandy the dog, of course.
Brandy is great in that scene.
So the huge paroxysms of violence that start to happen in the sequence are so utterly shocking that they can't be anything but absolutely hilarious. They will likely be some of the funniest things we will see this year in cinema.
By far, I was crying laughing during this climax.
I was laughing, but I was still trying to like discern like how horrific the scene was. But I can tell you the people around me in the theater were fucking howling.
My theater was also working on the movie's way. Everybody was laughing. I think, partially from shock and from just absurdity of this. But I was just dying at how funny this joke is of like, you know what? Let's take this event that is pretty much seen as the death of the golden age of Hollywood, the hippie free love movement, all of this, and let us make fun of these assholes. And that has always been kind of a cornerstone of my belief structure, is like, you have to make fun of people to in some way take away their power and their mythic stature.
Right. But it also, you have to earn that with a certain amount of distance from an event. And that distance comes in terms of time, and it comes in terms of emotion. And I think maybe this is one of the reasons that Sharon Tate is not as prominent a character in the film, is that it has to earn a distance.
Exactly. And So, I mean, just effects wise, the violence in this scene is so great. I mean, it's a Tarantino movie. You would expect that, but it is.
That broken nose appliance on Sadie is so gruesome.
It's great. And then when I think it's, I think her name was Susan, the other woman, that he just beats her face in with on the receiver of a telephone, like just over and over, and then beats her face on like a table. It's just so excessive that it can't not be funny. Like, and it's a real
now,
dummy.
Keep in mind, it's exceedingly gruesome. I mean, this is like Kill Bill, like House of Blue Leaves level of like gore and violence.
But then they have like the records playing. I can't remember the song that's playing, but it is being played for absolute heightened hysteria.
Yeah. Meanwhile, in the pool out back, Rick Dalton has his headphones on and is listening to music at top volume and singing his heart out, floating in the pool with a giant margarita, still very, very drunk. And who comes bursting out of the sliding glass door but a very injured and completely deranged Sadie? She then proceeds to fall into the pool and completely freak out. And what happens then, Drew?
Well, earlier in the movie, in fact, in the first kind of inciting incident with the meeting with Al Pacino's character, we see some of Rick Dalton's past film work. One of the films that he was in was a World War II film called The 14 Fists of McCluskey. I love that title.
It's a very Tarantino title, and it's kind of like a Tarantino movie.
Right. In that scene from that movie, he is burning a bunch of Nazi officers with a flamethrower. It's been in the marketing. I also love the little flashback insert they have of Rick handling the flamethrower, and he's like, hey, that heat's really hot on my face. Can we do something about the heat? Rick, it's a flamethrower.
Yeah.
But so Sadie falls into the pool and she freaks out and starts coming at Rick. He gets out of the pool and he runs to his shed, and the reveal where it's like underneath the camera's like viewing through the underside of like the pool chairs or something, and we just see the tip of the flamethrower come in.
Oh, my audience lost it.
Oh, we all, like, my audience was laughing and cheering and applauding at that moment. We were all like, yes! It was, and then he just torches the fuck out of Sadie while she's in this pool. It's glorious.
And yet it also kind of makes us aware that, you know, we are laughing and enjoying this horrifyingly like realistic level of violence with people's noses breaking and their faces smashing in, and it's utter lunacy and it's ultra violence for entertainment, and Quentin Tarantino knows this and knows we will enjoy it and is letting us sort of be that, you know, level of sick fuck, but in a way that's like saying, this is the punchline to this movie.
Well, this is very much the exact same thing he did with Inglourious Bastards. Like, he is taking this historical figure or figures and this moment and allowing the fiction of film to create a catharsis through violence of these mythical villains in our pop culture and our history, and saying, well, fuck them. Through movies, we can win, we can defeat them, and we can enjoy how awful and gruesome and ridiculous our defeat of them can be.
All this aside, like, this is all wonderful. It's hilarious. The effects are incredible. The end of the movie is super heartwarming. It goes back to the idea that, you know, Cliff is the man of action and Rick is the insecure guy who worries that his role as playing the hero is done. But in this scenario, Cliff gets to do all the ass kicking. Rick gets to feel like the hero, and their friendship is sort of solidified as something that is going to last forever. That they won't necessarily have to say goodbye to each other. You know, as Cliff goes away in the ambulance, you know, he says, "I'll see you tomorrow."
Yep. Because Rick is immediately like, which hospital are you going to? You know, come tell me and I'll meet you there. And Cliff is like, nah. I'm going to be all doped up and everything. You see me tomorrow. Go back in bed with your beautiful Italian wife. And he's like, she's taking like 5 sleeping pills. She's going to be out. I want to come be with you. Cliff's like, don't worry about it. And he's like, you know, I'll see you tomorrow. And they close the door on the ambulance. And before it drives off, Rick taps on the glass and he just says, Cliff, thank you for being a good friend. And Cliff just gives him a nice, knowing salute and says, "I try." It is so beautiful. And then if that was the end of the movie, I'm already like tearing up thinking about it again. If that was the end of the movie, that would be perfect. But it's not done yet. And it turns out that Jay Sebring is right at the gate of their house, and he starts asking Rick, he's like, what, wow, geez, what happened? And Rick says, "Oh, a bunch of dirty fucking hippies broke into my house." Like,
oh yeah,
so funny. But then they start talking, and Jay brings up like, "Oh yeah, I loved you in the fort." He says like, "Well, what happened?" He's like, "Well, I had to kill one of them with a flamethrower," and and Jay Sebring's like, "Oh, like you did in the 14 Fists of McCluskey." And Rick's realization, he's like, "Yeah," and it's like, "Oh, that's a good movie." And Sharon Tate's voice comes on over the intercom for the gate, and she's saying like, "Oh my gosh, like, is everything okay?" And they're like, "Yeah, everyone's okay." And Rick and Sharon introduce themselves, and she says, "Well, hello, neighbor." And she says, "Are you okay?" And he's like, "Yeah, thank you. That's very kind of you to ask that. Thank you." And they're like, "Well, we're up, and would you like to come inside?" And the way the movie ends, which is with a bird's eye view, kind of this, the God eye.
The camera cranes up and out and over the roof of the house, and it ends as a shot of them in the driveway, and they go inside.
Yeah, of Sharon coming out and hugging Rick, and he's come in, he's been accepted. This is probably
being seen as a hero.
He's seen as a hero. He's in the world that he wants to be in. He's loved. And then the title comes up, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's beautiful. Like, it's genuinely, I have to say, this has got to be Tarantino's most heartwarming kind of, even with this giant, ridiculous, violent climax, it's his sweetest movie.
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah, it's the one that actually indulges in sentimentality in a way that feels entirely sincere.
Yeah, it earns it.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I think it uses its violence in a different way. Of course, Tarantino knows that we're going to revel in that sweet, sweet violence that he likes to dole out. But here it's presented as this catharsis that you earn, and this utterly hilarious, reclaiming. It's not like Inglourious Bastards, which was violent pretty much all the way through, and then awful, scalping close-ups and stuff like that, really gruesome. Which there's certainly things to enjoy in that, but by the time the climax of Inglourious Bastards rolls around, it doesn't earn that kind of holy shit reaction that you get in something like in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And it's not just the fact that they held off. It's not just a matter of time. It's the clever and well edited setup of things like the 14 Fists of McCluskey being shown in the beginning, and then I believe they talk about it again on the set of the Western. I think him and Timothy Olyphant talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's like, "Oh, it's a hell of a picture." Like, that's like, apparently from the way it's up, that was Rick's best starring role.
Mm-hmm.
That was the one where he felt the most like the hero, like the big name star.
Yeah. So by the time the flamethrower comes out at the end of the movie, that's the third time that thing shows up. So Tarantino knows the power of threes in storytelling. It's all very, very well set up to go off like that. If all that structural work wasn't there, it wouldn't play nearly as well as it does. I'm very, very impressed.
I love it. There's no question this is going to be one of the best movies of the year. It's already one of the most essential movies you see this year.
That's for sure.
It's interesting because I think obviously for you and I who have a love of film and how movies and television entertainment is made and history of that, there's that layer, but it works so beyond that. It works purely on character and performance and drama and theme.
But people have to be willing to accept that for a Tarantino film, and what, a lot of film fans have come to expect from Tarantino films, like, this is a pretty different offering. Yes, it still feels like Tarantino all the way throughout, but it's not the same kind of movie.
I don't know. It's fascinating. For me, this is the first film that feels like it came from the filmmaker who made Jackie Brown.
Yeah, there's a sincerity and an ease to it that feels welcoming.
Yeah, I mean, we did an episode on Jackie Brown, and that screening really solidified it as one of my top favorites in his filmography. And it's interesting because after Jackie Brown, he goes and makes Kill Bill. He makes, all these movies that kind of feel like his most indulgent, most cartoon desires of playing with what he loves about cinema. And I love all those movies, but Jackie Brown was a movie that felt like, wow, from where he went from Pulp Fiction to Jackie Brown, there's a real evolution and a maturity happening here in his approach to storytelling and structure and character and drama and dialogue and everything. And then we got Kill Bill through Hateful Eight, which was like, oh, this is the Tarantino we've come to expect. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood feels, like I said at the beginning, this feels like it can only be made by an older director. I know Brian Tallarico, in his review for RogerEbert.com, said that this is a movie that Tarantino could have made as a younger man, but it would have been so much worse.
Mm-hmm. I can't help but agree.
Yeah, he needed that age and wisdom and ability to look back at himself and his own career, because that is part of what I think the movie and Rick Dalton is doing.
Yeah, it's a retrospective film.
Yes, and it's with that age and with that time that he's made something that feels so earnest, so, I called it huggy. Like, it's just a weird thing to say about a Tarantino movie, but there was so much of this movie I felt hugged by.
Yeah, it's affectionate. It is certainly nostalgic, and in ways that don't always feel crass. Like, there's certainly some like crass, brand placement and sort of stuff like that, but it's not inorganic. It certainly feels like part of the texture of the world.
Well, I mean, the last piece of film we see is Rick Dalton filming an ad for Red Apple tobacco.
Right, which I'm glad they didn't actually make part of the the film proper, because that's hugely winking.
No, this is a perfect post-credits scene. I mean, it's so funny because it's like, oh, cigarettes, and also, you get less throat burn and like all this stuff. It's so, and then of course when they cut, he's like, this cigarette tastes like shit.
Yeah.
And who picked this standee for the cardboard cutout of him? I have a double chin. It's so funny. And then the movie also ends with a radio ad for a contest from the Batman 60s, so which just made me, that was the most giddy for nostalgia I got. Anyways, I love this movie the more and more I think about it, and we didn't even get to talk about everything, obviously, with as lengthy of a movie as it is, but I'm ready to see it again. I really think this is going to easily be one of the standouts of the year.
I agree. This is one of the first theatrical films I've seen this year that really made me feel like, oh, okay, I got what I paid for.
Well, let's go to the shelf where we pick a movie that might act as a good pairing or substitute for our main topic. And as always, we want to encourage you, loyal listeners, to go to GenreVision.com and comment on the post for this episode with your own shelf picks. Travis, what are you going to pull off the shelf for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
Another film that takes place sort of on the western side of the United States, the sort of casting off the 60s and welcoming the 70s, and the sort of despair that certain people felt about the time politically, and the ongoing Vietnam War. I couldn't help but think when I was watching Once Upon a Time in Hollywood that Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas would be an exceptionally good shelf pick.
I like it.
And it has a similar sort of attitude, I feel like, the idea of being wistful for a time and then having to accept the new reality as the 70s came and took over America. And this is also a movie about a really odd male friendship. Of course, the friendship between Benicio del Toro and Johnny Depp's characters in the film is quite a bit different than the one that Cliff and Rick share in Once Upon a Time. But there is still sort of an affection that is shown on screen. Like when they're saying goodbye to Benicio del Toro's character in the movie Dr. Gonzo, and he talks about him getting on the plane. He's too weird to live, too rare to die. And there's what feels like the most sincere moment in the movie right there.
Absolutely. Well, I would say as a comparison, if Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is the chill out smoking a joint, Fear and Loathing is the bad acid trip.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean,
literally at times. I mean,
there are many bad acid trips in.
Well, not just that. Well, when they take that, like whatever the stuff is from an adrenal gland or something.
Adrenochrome.
Yeah. But I mean, yeah, definitely one of Gilliam's best, one of Depp's best performances. A fantastic picture.
Agreed. What are you pulling off the shelf, sir?
Well, I am actually also going to pull a Johnny Depp movie. Ed Wood from Tim Burton.
That's a good movie.
Yeah, it's a great movie, and arguably, I would say if somebody wants to argue Ed Wood is Burton's best movie, I may not have a case against them. But I think there are some other interesting parallels. A big part of the movie is about a male friendship between Ed Wood and Bela Lugosi, who's an actor who feels like he's on the outs of his career. He is. But also, it is very romantic about a different kind of film that was being made in Hollywood, and the structure in place, to the point where it is not at all interested in being a true recreation. It is a fantasy. Like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Ed Wood ends with a fantasy sequence.
Yeah, I love the inclusion of Vince. It's Vincent D'Onofrio as Orson Welles.
Well, not just that, but the idea that Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space got a giant theatrical premiere night. Mm-hmm. Like, that did not happen. I can't. And Ed Wood, ending the movie with him sitting in the audience and looking at everybody and saying, "This is the one I'll be remembered for." And it's like, yeah, you will, is the worst director of all time, supposedly, by the Medveds, but it's that kind of fantasy, and it's so warm-hearted. And I mean, Martin Landau 100% earned his Oscar as Bela Lugosi.
No kidding. Yeah, let's shoot this fucker.
It is a phenomenal. It's an incredibly funny movie, just like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's a wonderful behind-the-scenes look at, if Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is how TV and studio movies get made, this was the low-budget, dirty grindhouse filmmaking of the time. And it's really beautiful. I love that movie more and more as I get older.
I'll vouch for Ed Wood any day. Please see it if you have not.
So let's do some currently consuming.
Nom, 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
This is probably going to take only 30 seconds. I watched Blade 2 for the first time in a long time. Blade 2 is probably still my favorite Blade movie, if only by a very, 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 very small margin. In retrospect, Blade 2 is not as good as I thought it was. It is really at its best when it's just being a monster movie. Any sort of attempt at dramaturgy is pretty inert. It doesn't really make an argument for itself as a cool movie. It's a pretty just outright geeky movie. The first Blade, however, has like way more attitude. It's a much cooler movie, and in some respects, I there are aspects of the first Blade that I prefer quite a bit more. But Blade 2, certainly worth a rewatch if you haven't seen it in a long time, but really it's most effective as a monster film. And I wanted to sort of get a taste of where the character had been. I watched Blade Trinity back when you and Danny did it for... Hi, Danny! When you and Danny had done it for Third Time's the Charm. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, okay, let's turn back the clock a little bit. Let's turn back the clock a little bit and figure out what's going on in Blade 2. And it's okay. Again, I like it maybe just a tiny CH more than Blade 1, but only for monster movie reasons.
Well, yeah, if you want to hear my thoughts on Blade 2, become a subscriber at patreon.com/GenreVision, because Danny and I talked about Blade and Blade 2 on our supplemental episode for the Blade Trinity episode.
All right. What have you been currently consuming?
Well, in the spirit of Quentin Tarantino's love of Italian filmmakers, I watched a schlocky Italian-made, well, directed at least, movie called Night Killer. This is directed by Claudio Fragasso, who most people will know as the director of Troll 2, with some uncredited additional scenes shot by Bruno Mattei. These guys are Italian crap master legends. And I just get in these moods. There was even movies I didn't do for currently consuming that I watched. I was like, I just get in these dumpster dive moods where I'm like, I want to watch
a real piece of trash.
Well, because that was such a formative part of my cinema upbringing, and because you do that because you want to find those gems.
Yeah, and Italian movies are a particularly good place to look for stuff like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is actually shot, this was released in 1990. So it's, fairly late in the game for this stuff. So it's like, oh, they're shooting with sync sound. It's not like the
old
old
pretty
days.
Different for an Italian movie.
Yeah, but it's not, filmed in Italy. It's just an Italian production. You know, it's all American actors for the most part, and it's basically like this. I'm sorry if this sounds offensive, because it is, because this is so scummy of a movie, but that's part of its appeal. It's about a serial killer that's going around wearing basically a Freddy Krueger mask and this weird rubber glove. And his method of killing people is just to kind of punch through them, which is great. Like every single kill is just a close up of a torso with this rubber claw glove coming through it. And he attacks this woman and he assaults her, and she's so traumatized by the experience that she suffers total amnesia. She doesn't know who she is or anything about herself. And in the course of the movie, she then gets kidnapped by another different guy who it's like, okay, is this her assaulter that's you know, doing this to her again? Is this the killer? So there's this like stupid mystery element. This is a movie, I can't spoil it because the ending blew my friggin' mind. It's so audacious. It's what you want from this kind of movie, where the performances aren't, it's not that they're bad, it's that like, who directed you and how do you think this is anything like people speak or say, which are great. I had to rip a scene from it because it was so ridiculous to me, in which the main female character confronts this assaulter in a bathroom and makes him strip down and flush his clothes down the toilet. It's so funny, and obviously it's not intended to be, but it's so great. If you like that kind of stuff, I watched quite a few movies this week on my dumpster dive, and none of them really lived up to the hype, except Night Killer. Night Killer is one that I'm like, this is it. It is a sleazier, nastier cousin to the specific kind of oddity that Troll 2 is.
All right then.
Yeah, if you can stomach, I mean, it's gross. You're not going to like a lot of it because of its subject material, in dealing with assault and everything. But it's just so comically wrong-headed and bizarre, and where it ends, I was just beside myself with laughter. So there's a release out. I think it's by Severn Films. Recently released that on Blu-ray. So check that out, Night Killer. And let's wrap things up with our
Comment of the Week.
And last week's episode was on Police Story 2. And unfortunately, we only got one comment for that episode, but that's okay because it's from loyal listener DT Grizzler. And DT Grizzler provided us with a shelf pick, which I always love. Thank you. And DT Grizzler says their shelf pick is Lethal Weapon 2. Also a cop story with a very jokey tone. Yeah, the bomb in the toilet scenes in that one. I forgot that. Until the last 45 minutes where it goes super grim. I've only seen Lethal Weapon and Lethal Weapon 2, and I don't remember Lethal Weapon 2, except I remember the bomb in the toilet scene.
It did that on Mythbusters.
Oh, really?
Whether or not you could sit on a toilet for that long.
But yeah, I don't remember. I have a fondness for the original Lethal Weapon, but yeah, maybe I need to go back and revisit Lethal Weapon 2. It might be worth it. But also I wanted to say DT Grizzler said that I love that Drew's pick was Nighthawks. I have so many nostalgic feelings for that movie because it was always on cable when I was a kid. Rutger Hauer was amazing. To this day, every time I see Stallone, I flash back to him yelling Wolfgar in a disco. And I only mention this because I just picked that, and then a few days later, Rutger Hauer passed away. And, you know, that was just a weird coincidence of timing. R.I.P. Rutger Hauer, one of the greats.
Truly. Yeah, we're going to miss Rutger Hauer quite dearly. I definitely have a list of Rutger Hauer films to rewatch now. The first of which will be Split Second.
Yeah, there's so many. So go out, and you can't go, like, even if it's not a good movie, Rutger Hauer is always bringing his A game.
No question.
He was a true actor.
I don't know about Dracula 3D, but you know what? We're going to speak ill of the dead.
That's right. And I haven't seen it, so I've seen pieces of it. But yeah, I think that's going to wrap it up for this week. Next week, we're going to kick off August with another themed month, and our theme for the month is Scary Parents. Scarents, which Travis coined and I love. And we're going to start off with John Waters' Serial Mom. So make sure to come back and join us. I love these theme months that we do. And this is going to be a fun one because there's a couple movies on here that you and I both have not seen.
That would be correct. Yeah, I am greatly looking forward to Scary Parents Month. That is all August. Serial Mom, The Stepfather, Coraline, and Parents. Chew on that.
As always, we want to thank you all so much for listening. I'm Drew Deitch.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week.
Right here on GenreVision.